You look fine, but you're not fine. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about. Welcome to Fine, But Not Fine, the podcast about navigating rare disease, healthcare battles, and the messy reality of chronic illness. I'm Kelly Paul, and I've been living with Mycosis Fungoides since 2015. This is a space for real talk, real experiences, and practical advice. Because surviving is one thing, but figuring out how to actually live, that's the hard part. Hey everyone, I hope you're having a great day. We've got a big topic today, and that's that most people with my disease wait years to find out they have it. It could be 2 years, 4 years, sometimes it's 6. For me, it took about 4 to 6 months. And I have known for quite some time that I am the odd one out. And when I say 4 to 6 months to another patient, there's usually either a pause or a wow on the other side of that. And I know exactly why mine went the way it did. And it wasn't that somebody biopsied me early. I'll come back to that because I did get an early biopsy and it was wrong. It's that I found a very good doctor early. And that's really the whole answer. And it bothers me a little bit because it isn't an answer anyone can act on. You can't write find a good doctor into a clinical guideline. You can't legislate it. I can't stand up in front of a committee and recommend it. And I certainly can't tell a person who's been fighting for 4 years that the thing they were missing was better luck. So that's the episode today. What actually made the difference in my case and why what we think are the obvious fixes, or the ones I would have proposed myself, just don't hold up when you look at them. And I'll tell you now, there is no policy recommendation waiting at the end of this episode. I don't have one. What I've got is 4 real obstacles, and I think they're worth understanding on their own, particularly if you're someone who spent years being told it was eczema, and you've wondered ever since whether that was somebody's fault or bad luck or something else entirely. So let me start with the ordinary version of this story because you need it in your head before I tell you mine. So what usually happens? Something appears on your skin. It could be a patch, maybe a few. It resembles eczema or psoriasis, or a fungal infection, or contact dermatitis. And it genuinely does resemble those things, and that's not a small point. So you're treated for eczema, you're given a steroid cream, it works a little, and the patch fades, and you assume the matter is closed. Then it returns, or a new one appears someplace else. You get more cream, a stronger cream, maybe a different diagnosis now. Maybe it's psoriasis, or it's fungal. So here's an antifungal, or maybe it's stress, or have you changed your laundry detergent? And this can continue for a very long time. And I want to give you some actual numbers, right? Because there are several, and I'd rather you have them than have me just pick one, right? That might be more alarming than another. So the traditionally cited figure, and this is the one you'll see repeated most often, is 3 to 6 years. And that's measured from when the lesions first appear to a definitive diagnosis. Medscape's clinical reference puts the median right at 6 years. The most recent number I found comes from a 2025 paper by Beatty and colleagues. They surveyed nearly 400 physicians and compared the results against an international patient registry called ProClippi. Just over 60% of the cutaneous lymphoma specialists reported an average time to diagnosis of 2 to 4 years for early stage, and more than a quarter reported longer than 4 years. So somewhere between 2 and 6 years, depending on the source. And all of the sources are in the show notes on my website. I want you to consider that 2 to 6 years as a stretch of somebody's life rather than just as a number. And what I mean by that is it's 2 to 6 years of appointments and creams and something on your body that isn't improving, and you pretty much figure nobody's explaining it to you right. And there's a part of this that I think gets overlooked. When you are being treated for a minor skin complaint that isn't resolving, it can start to feel like a nuisance. Whether or not anyone in that office actually thinks so, it's easy for our mind to begin to wonder on the fourth or the fifth visit whether you're the person who worries more than the situation warrants. And I've heard that from patients before. It's not that a doctor said something unkind. It's more often it's that nobody said anything at all and the patient has filled in the silence themselves. And once you've started managing how you come across, you start editing what you report. You mention the new patch, but not that it's been keeping you up because you don't want to be difficult. And this is its own kind of problem because the information a physician needs in order to notice that something isn't behaving normally is exactly the information you may have decided not to volunteer. And there's a paper out there with some information on this. It's called Real Life Barriers to Diagnosis in Early Mycosis Fungoides. And it's an international expert panel, dermatologist, I think hematologist, oncologist, a dermatopathologist, excuse my pronunciation, who gathered specifically to work out why this disease takes so long to identify. And one of the patterns they name is community dermatologists diagnosing Mycosis fungoides as an inflammatory skin condition, then treating it with long-term topical steroids without a biopsy and without careful follow-up. And that's not an unusual failure. That's the ordinary one. So here's what happened to me. For a couple of years before any of this began properly, I had a spot, and I mean one spot, literally one tiny spot. It appeared, my primary care doctor gave me something to put on it, it went away. That is the prelude. And at the time, it didn't register as anything because guess what? I saw someone, they gave me something, it fixed the problem. Then something appeared that didn't go away. On my leg first, then my shoulder, then across my trunk. My primary care doctor looked at it and said I really should see a dermatologist. And so I did what most people would do. I found one who had openings and wasn't too far from home, and I scheduled an appointment. and, and I knew it was a bad fit for me almost from when I walked in the door. Okay, now I am not going to name her. I am not interested in making her a villain because we were genuinely a bad fit for each other. And that happens. But the reason I knew is worth describing because I think it's a structural signal rather than a personal one. And that's that from the moment I walked in, everything about that practice was hyper-focused on beauty, on cosmetic dermatology. And that's what the space was designed for, and that's what it was selling. And then I had the visit itself. I felt as though she didn't really consult with me, and she didn't take much of a history at all. She glanced at my skin, declared it eczema, and said she would take a biopsy just to be sure. And I want you to remember that because it becomes important a little bit later. She took a biopsy immediately on the first visit. She took it from my shoulder. Now, nobody explained to me what a biopsy involved. Nobody said anything about aftercare. And I was traveling a lot for work at that time. So I was managing a wound I'd kind of been told nothing about. The site became infected, or at least that's how it appeared to me, so I went back about it. She told me it wasn't infected. She actually told me I was overreacting. She told me it was completely normal, and then she prescribed an antibiotic. And that's what set off my alarm bells, right? That was the threshold for me. That is the moment that I decided things cannot continue with this dermatologist. She said I was overreacting. She said this is normal. And she said, here's an antibiotic. And then, of course, the biopsy came back as ordinary dermatitis. So needless to say, I walked out of that office committed to never returning. Total time with her was about 2 weeks, okay? So I sat down and worked out on my own. What I needed was a board-certified dermatologist. And I'll be honest, this wasn't obvious to me beforehand. I had to arrive at it. Board certification means the physician completed the training, passed the exams, and maintains the credential. And for me, it signals an interest in being excellent at the work rather than merely being permitted to do it. And that was a filter I applied myself. Nobody instructed me to. There's no point in the process where someone handed me that information. Now, I found a clinic in Greensboro where every dermatologist was board certified. I called him and I was told it would be 3 months as a new patient before I could be seen. Now, keep in mind, this is 11, 12 years ago. I asked whether I could be seen if somebody canceled, was told that cancellations don't go to new patients. I don't know if that's still their policy. So I waited the time, went in for my scheduled appointment, obviously met the doctor, and I liked him immediately. He was conversational and curious. He asked good questions and then he listened to the answers. And he was really inquisitive in a way that made it evident he was working the problem rather than matching it to the nearest familiar thing. He also was not critical of my prior dermatologist, not once. And I know that sounds like a strange thing to appreciate given that I'd walked in there with a grievance, but it told me something about him. He did not know what had happened in that room, and he wasn't going to perform outrage in order to bond with me. That spoke to his professionalism, and it made me trust him more rather than less. Then he took a scraping, he examined it under the microscope himself, he looked at all of my skin, every bit of it. He explained why shoulder biopsies can be difficult, and we discussed the keloid scar that had formed at the biopsy site and why it had formed there. And then he said he wanted to biopsy a patch on my thigh because that was the location most likely to reveal information. He told me it would take a couple of weeks to get an answer, and it did. It was a Thursday night. I'll never forget this, 6 o'clock. And he called. And I have to tell you, my husband was out of town, and I have never had a doctor call me after hours, not once in my life. And I didn't take the call. I looked at the phone. I knew what an after hours call from a doctor meant, and I decided I did not want to hear it right then by myself on a Thursday night. Nuts, right? Maybe. I'd probably do it again. Friday morning, he called back early before the traditional business day starts, and I decided I really had to take that call, so I did. And he told me that I had Mycosis Fungoides. And then he explained it, all of it, what that is, how it typically progresses, how it's likely to be treated. He went on, and every bit of it was information I needed. And then he said something I still think about, which was, call me Monday, let's talk, because you're not going to remember half of what I just told you, and we'll go through it again. And you can ask me whatever you've come up with for questions then. He knew that moment you hear the word lymphoma, the rest of the conversation goes somewhere you just cannot retrieve it from. So he built the second conversation into the first one. And I found out later that he really had suspected that I had Mycosis fungoides almost immediately, but he wanted the confirmation before even saying anything like that out loud. And then I came to find out he had done part of his residency in the cutaneous lymphoma clinic at Duke with a specialist who now treats my MF. So what actually made the difference? I said at the beginning that the answer, at least for me, was finding a very good doctor. But I want to be specific about what that meant in practice because good doctor on its own is pretty vague and not particularly useful to anybody. So start with a biopsy, since that is where most people assume the answer to quick diagnosis lives. Both dermatologists biopsied me, or at least both took a sample, but only one of them came back with a good answer. The first one did a biopsy on my first visit within minutes of meeting me, which is faster than most patients with this disease ever get. And hers came back pretty much saying it was ordinary dermatitis. And hers came back that way because a biopsy really is not a test you simply order and receive an answer from. She took a sample from my shoulder. She hadn't taken a real history. She hadn't examined all of my skin, and there was nothing for the result to be interpreted against. Now, the second dermatologist chose my thigh. At that time, that sounded to me like a reasonable choice, and it wasn't just reasonable, it was expertise. There's actually a Brazilian study that looked at 67 early-stage Mycosis fungoides patients, and 98.5% of them had lesions on sun-protected areas. The characteristic distribution of this disease is the parts of the body that don't see sun. Thigh, not shoulder. He wasn't guessing, he was seeing a pattern he already recognized. So it was never about how quickly somebody cut into me. It was about who was holding the instrument, where they chose to take the sample, and what they already knew before they even walked into the exam room. And here's the part really that's kind of difficult. I was diagnosed within 4 to 6 months instead of 4 to 6 years because I happened to select from a list of board-certified dermatologists at a clinic near where I lived and worked, one of the small number of general dermatologists in this country who trained in a cutaneous lymphoma clinic. I didn't know that when I booked the appointment. There was no way for me to know it because it wasn't in any directory and I wouldn't have given it any value. So when I say I found a very good doctor, what I mean probably more precisely is that I found one with the exact right training by accident on the first try. That isn't a system working correctly, and it's why I can't offer it to anybody as advice, which leaves the question, right? What could actually be changed instead? And that's where it gets complicated. So the first difficulty is the disease looks like something else. That is the first thing standing in the way for early mycosis fungoides because it genuinely mimics common inflammatory skin conditions. And that is not a footnote about this disease, it is the defining characteristic of it. So when a dermatologist looks at an early patch and says eczema, that isn't carelessness. Most of the time, a patch that looks like eczema is eczema. The overwhelming majority of rashes are ordinary rashes, and treating them as ordinary is correct almost every single time. And that's what makes this hard rather than simply broken. A physician who assumed lymphoma every time they saw a persistent patch would be wrong constantly and would be putting an enormous number of people through procedures they simply do not need. So the failure isn't in the first assumption, it's in what happens when the first assumption stops working. And I'll come back to that because I think it's pretty useful. Now, the second difficulty is the biopsy often can't answer yet. And this is surprising to me. I'm not a medical professional, right? And it's why biopsy earlier doesn't solve this the way it sounds like it should. Early mycosis fungoides is difficult to diagnose under a microscope, not just difficult to identify on skin, but truly difficult to confirm in a laboratory. At the earliest stage, the changes in cells that would tell a pathologist this is lymphoma may be barely present or not present yet. The sample can look like eczema under magnification because on that slide on that day, there genuinely isn't enough difference to call it. DermNet, which is a clinical dermatology reference out of New Zealand, states it pretty plainly. They say early stage disease can be very subtle under the microscope and mimic other conditions, and multiple biopsies are often required to reach a diagnosis. Medscape's clinical reference is more specific. They say early lesions may produce a non-diagnostic result, so confusion with benign conditions is common, and their recommendation? Obtain repeat biopsies in patients whose skin condition is progressing or isn't responding to topical treatment. Repeat. More than one. And that international expert panel I mentioned earlier is more specific still. They call for 2 or more punch biopsies taken from the most representative lesions, with 6 millimeters preferred. They also note that topical steroids should be stopped at least 2 weeks beforehand, because the treatment given for the wrong diagnosis can obscure the right one. And I want a little sidebar here. I always stop my topical steroids before I go see my specialist or my regular dermatologist 2 weeks beforehand in case they need to do anything like this. So think about what that means for the idea of biopsying everyone sooner. It doesn't produce answers, it actually produces large numbers of results that don't say anything definitive, which means more biopsies, more scars, more cost, and a really long period of not knowing, which if you have ever lived inside a diagnostic unknown, you understand that carries its own weight. And I've talked on the show about cascades, right? About how one test leads to one specialist, leads to another test. That isn't a symptom of bad medicine. It's what happens when you make a system more sensitive, and it means the most obvious fix generates the exact problem I've spent a few episodes describing. Now, the third difficulty is that nobody can be trained on everything. And I really had to think about this, and all of this I had to think about. Why aren't we doing this? And sit down and give it the thought. The natural next request is education. We need to teach dermatologists to recognize Mycosis fungoides. And the problem here is simple math. The estimated worldwide incidence, according to DermNet, is roughly 6.4 per million people per year. A general dermatologist in a community practice might see one case in an entire career or might see none at all. So if I stand up in a room and ask for dedicated training on recognizing my specific disease, I'm asking for substantial attention to be spent on something almost none of those physicians will ever encounter. And that isn't a Mycosis fungoides problem. That is a rare disease problem. Now, NORD, National Organization for Rare Diseases, now counts more than 10,000 known rare diseases. And every one of those communities obviously wants their condition included in the curriculum. And every one of them has a patient like me or you with a story that makes it feel urgent. They cannot all be accommodated because the arithmetic doesn't allow it. So the disease-specific request doesn't survive, and I don't think it should. But there is something in there that I think could survive. The thing worth teaching isn't the disease. It's the moment of recognition that a diagnosis has stopped working. A rash that's been treated for months and isn't responding the way the diagnosis predicts. A rash whose diagnosis needs to be reconsidered. And that principal doesn't need to know anything about mycosis fungoides. It also could catch cutaneous lupus or sarcoidosis and drug reactions and other lymphomas or atypical infections, and I'm sure a host of conditions I've never heard of. Which brings me to the number that I think reframes the entire question. Each of those 10,000 diseases is rare. Collectively, they are not. The National Institute of Health estimates that roughly 30 million Americans are living with a rare disease. Now, that's about 1 in 10 of us. 1 in 10. So a physician who will almost certainly never see my disease will absolutely see a rare disease over and over across a career. Not mine, but somebody's. And that could change what we're actually asking for. It isn't a request to spend curriculum time on a condition nobody encounters. It's a request to prepare physicians for a category of patient they encounter constantly and often don't recognize as a category at all. And from where I'm sitting right now, that's the only version of rare disease education I found that holds up structurally. Now, there is a fourth difficulty. You have to get through the door. No clinical guideline can address it, and it's one I keep returning to in this podcast. And it's suppose you have solved everything I have described so far. Physicians trained to notice when a diagnosis stops working. Sensible practices around repeat biopsies. All of it. You still have to be able to see one of those physicians. I waited 3 months. AMN Healthcare runs an annual survey of physician appointment wait times across 15 major American metropolitan areas. And their 2025 figures put the average wait for a non-urgent dermatology appointment at 36.5 days, up from 34.5 in 2022. So my wait was roughly 3 times the national average. Granted, I was waiting for a board-certified physician. And the point I want to make about that isn't a complaint about waiting. It's that the good ones are full. That's what a 3-month wait indicates. There aren't enough highly qualified, board-certified specialists to go around. And the excellent ones, they have full patient loads, which is what you would expect. You can write any clinical guideline you like, but if there aren't enough physicians with the capacity to carry it out, you've written a wish rather than a policy. And underneath that, there's something considerably worse. There is a study by Andrew Credor, apologies if I haven't pronounced that correctly, and colleagues. It was published in the JAMA Dermatology in 2021. And researchers called 611 dermatology clinics across 28 states, posting as the family member of a patient with a new and changing mole. 1,833 calls in total, and the only variable was the type of insurance. With Blue Cross Blue Shield, they successfully booked an appointment 96% of the time. With Medicare, 94%. With Medicaid, 17%. I want to repeat that. 17%. And among those who did get an appointment, the wait was longer, a median of 13 days compared to 7. And the researchers also asked rejected callers for a referral elsewhere. And the clinics that turned a Medicaid patient away, only about 7% provided a referral that actually worked, meaning the clinic they named genuinely accepted the insurance. So for most of those patients, a closed door and no direction to go afterwards. Now, 2 caveats, because I want to be straight with you about this. Those calls were placed in February of 2020, so that data is 6 years old. And the complaint they used was a changing mole rather than a chronic rash. And the mole is triaged differently. But the shape of the finding, right, isn't in question. I waited 3 months, and I could wait 3 months. I got a job with flexibility. I had a car. The clinic was reachable. I had insurance the clinic accepted. I had the ability to keep making phone calls until something worked. And every one of those is something that somebody else doesn't have, and none of them are clinical. So here's where I've landed. I told you at the start that I found a very good doctor, and that this bothers me because it isn't an advice anyone can actually use, right? It's not actionable. Having walked through all 4 of those obstacles, I want to say where that leaves me. The first thing is that the work I did was real. And it also wasn't enough on its own. I fired a doctor. I sat down and determined what credential I should be looking for. I waited 3 months that I could afford to wait, and every one of those was a decision I made and an effort I expended. And none of it would have mattered if the physician at the end of it hadn't happened to train at Duke in a cutaneous lymphoma clinic. So the honest version is that I did the work and then I got lucky, and I can't separate the two, which means I also can't hand either half to somebody else. And that's a pretty uncomfortable conclusion for someone who does advocacy work. I would rather sit in front of a legislative committee and describe a policy. What I actually have is that the thing that worked was me having the time, the money, the information, and the nerve to walk out of an office, and then the good fortune about who was on the other side of the next door. The second thing is that when I ask myself what I'd actually want changed, knowing everything I have just described, the answer is smaller and a whole lot less satisfying than I expected. I wouldn't ask for more biopsies across the board because I don't think that survives the problem of early stage results that can't say anything definitive. I think it would produce a great deal of uncertainty and not much clarity. What I'd want instead is for physicians to be taught the moment rather than the disease. When a skin condition isn't responding the way the diagnosis predicts, the diagnosis is the thing to question first. I'd want returning to be built into the plan rather than left to the patient to initiate. If a treatment is started on the assumption it's eczema, I'd want the next appointment scheduled with explicit understanding of what happens if it hasn't responded by then, and make it so that coming back isn't something you, the patient, have to work up the nerve to do. It is just the next step, and both you and the medical practitioner knew it was coming. I would want more board-certified specialists because a guideline nobody has the capacity to carry out isn't really a guideline. And I'd want more acknowledgement that the clinical questions are the easier half of this problem. The harder half is that my outcome depended on insurance, geography, flexibility at work, and a coincidence about where one physician happened to complete part of his residency. And the last thing, which is the one I most want to say to you, if you're someone whose diagnosis took years, that wasn't you being dramatic, and it probably wasn't one physician failing you either. It was a disease that looks like something ordinary, examined by people who see the ordinary version constantly, using a test that frequently can't answer the question at that stage, inside a system where the physicians most likely to recognize it are the hardest ones to get in to see. Thanks for listening to Fine But Not Fine. If this episode resonated with you, subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And if you got a story, question, or just need to vent, reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and keep on going.